Don't play with that.
What's with the headgear?
I'm just finishing up the episode right now.
You're watching it right now?
I'm watching it right now, and
what do you think's gonna happen?
Done. Hey, and welcome to Polite Fight. I am John Tatey here with Gus Spellman to talk about Episode 4, Season 2 of Better Call Saul. Gloves Off is the title. Gus, we didn't find a lot cinematically to talk about in this episode, so we're going to make an episode about characters. Because there was a lot of subtle or maybe layered characterization, I think, in this episode. So this is a Mike-centric episode, so let's start out talking about Mike.
We have not talked a lot about Mike on this. I think actually we may not have talked about him at all
in our season
the
2
first 3
conversations.
episodes. Yeah. And the reason is that Mike is not really, I don't know, I don't think he's really that interesting a character here. But this was, when he sits down, this was like the first time that I really felt emotionally connected to Mike. I think certainly in Better Call Saul, and maybe even in Breaking Bad.
To me, that fits with the character. I think we, as the viewer, have trouble getting close to Mike because that's the kind of guy that he is. I think that the writing very deftly keeps us at a little bit of a distance from Mike in the same way that he keeps everybody around him at something of a distance.
Well, that's interesting because at the same time, he's a character that both in Breaking Bad and here, we get all the stuff of him like watching his granddaughter and like watching her like play on the playground. Normally you'd think like this is go-to like insight into his motivation. It's just too cliche, you know?
And that makes total sense. Let me say though that works for me because Mike is never totally present. I feel when he's doing that. There's always something else in Mike's mind. He's always off somewhere else, doing the math, figuring out the angles on how he's going to protect his family. So I actually don't think it's quite as maudlin as you make it out to be.
Yeah, that's interesting. And maybe that's why this scene, I finally felt a connection with him because you basically know what he's thinking about. And because of the way that it's edited, you're putting things together. So it almost feels like your thought process is connecting you with what's probably in Mike's mind. Just, throwing the money on the table and he's already done the deed.
Right.
And then you see how like bad it got. You just get like more and more information. And then they like use that to siphon you right into this moment where he is like clearly like dealing with some shit when he sits down on the couch.
And what significance did you take from the fact that he applies crinkle cut carrots of all vegetables they could have chosen to apply? I'm just fucking.
I was like,
I'll tell you what my favorite Mike shot is when he sips the beer and kind of goes, ah. I don't know if we've ever seen Mike take a load off before. That humanized him for me. Humanizing him a little less was the Vietnam bit with the gun dealer.
Yeah.
It was just a little pat. And we're coming off talking about Fargo Season 2, where I think that series really explored how this affected not only the psyche of the individual characters, but the psyche of the nation in a very rich way. And maybe it's because we're coming off that comparison, but here it just felt like, oh, he was, Mike was in the shit. So that's another aspect of pain for him.
I agree. I think that the only thing that's interesting about it is that they don't make a big deal about it. They don't give him any sort of like close-up or moment where he's looking through the rifle so that you can be like, oh, Mike's reliving Vietnam or anything like that.
They come close. He points the rifle at that painting on the wall that's like a river.
But it's not overwrought, I think,
no,
at least.
It's not.
I think it's you're right that it's pat, but it's also subtle.
Yeah, I wasn't offended by it. I just thought, I hope that if they're going to introduce this part to his backstory, that they deepen it a little bit in the episodes to come.
It's interesting how many different backstories they've given, like how many, like to be like, this is where this guy's coming from. The whole story with his son that we got last season, his love and care for his granddaughter and daughter-in-law, and now this Vietnam stuff. It's like he's got more backstory than Jimmy practically. But I don't know what it is. I just don't care about him that much.
Well, I'm sure he'll be sad to hear that, Gus, but let's move on to Chuck.
There seems to be some disagreement in the comments about how hateable Chuck is. Jimmy Cole
Genie?
had a Jimmy, T-J-I-M-I.
To Jimmy, I'm
To
sure
Jimmy,
it's
I
to
think
Jimmy.
it's to Jimmy, to Jimmy Collet. Said, I think everyone's universal hatred of Chuck has gone a little bit overboard. He's obviously an antagonist in this story, but he's an antagonist who isn't willfully evil, just has a perspective that we don't agree with. That's the best kind of villain. And I thought that that was a good observation, but I think that the show definitely goes out of its way formally to make you dislike Chuck. And I think somebody else pointed out, Ed Ked, that the quote, ice cold snake-eyed corpse face Chuck puts on in the meeting scene really helps us turn against him. And that's true. Like, you just see him looking at that, and it's just like, ugh, I just shuddered a little bit. So I think that even though, if you look at it rationally, you can make an argument like Chuck's not such a bad guy, or he at least has like a rational motivation. The show wants you to be like, ah, oh, fucking Chuck.
I'm not sure about that. I think
Really?
that Chuck is portrayed with more complexity than that in this episode, because I feel that in this confrontational scene with Jimmy, like maybe this is the rational angle that you're talking about, but I really sympathized with Chuck's arguments and thought he had the better of Jimmy really throughout that conversation. Jimmy's concentrated so much on this short-term Sandpiper. He wants to see Sandpiper through. He clearly thinks this is his case, but Chuck is showing him, like, look, you have this whole universe of other people who are affected by your actions. When are you going to grow up and own that? And I think he has a really good point.
I think that he definitely does, in that sense, get the better of Jimmy. But I think that Jimmy still has the high ground here in that, like, Chuck, even though he's doing the right thing, and he even puts it in that legal speak, he's doing the wrong thing. He is using Kim's demotion to get to Jimmy. That's wrong. And at least from Jimmy's point of view, and I think from our point of view, Jimmy doesn't really deserve it. So even though nobody could convict Chuck, whereas they could convict Jimmy, Jimmy's the good guy who does the wrong thing, and Chuck is the bad guy who does the right thing. I think that they're really setting up that dichotomy.
Can we talk about Howard real quick?
Yes, one of my favorite characters.
I feel like Howard doesn't get enough love. Now, here's not a lot of shows I think would execute this character arc. Let me compare it to Game of Thrones, actually.
Oh, okay.
In Game of Thrones, we've got so many characters where you hate them for a while, and then they do something really obviously good, or we learn something in their backstory that changes their motivation, whatever. But
They're just humanized in some way.
they're humanized, they're made complex, but I think that Game of Thrones really is just like, oh, look at this terrible thing, and oh, look at this noble thing. But I think very few character actions are in that gray area. It's just that there's a mix of evil and good, and that our sympathies shift. What's interesting to me about Howard is that he started out, I think we really hated him. You know, there was really nothing redeeming about Howard.
He was the pig fucker.
He was the pig fucker. And what I like about Howard is that he hasn't come all the way back over to the light. I don't think we love Howard now and think that he's this noble hero, but I also think he's been semi-rehabilitated in the eyes of the viewer by the show.
Instead of doing something different that changes the way that we feel about him, he's been doing the same thing all along, and the way that we see has changed the way that we look at him.
Can I finish up by rubbing in this latest instance?
Yeah, all right.
3.
So
Do you have something from the comments?
Yeah, somebody in the comments pointed this out, and I was like,
oh, I noticed it. I
John
noticed
is
it
gonna
the
have
instant
fucking
it came
seen
on
this.
screen.
Big McLarge huge. Said, Polite Fights number 3 hypothesis gets another boost by Kim being star 3 on Jimmy's speed dial.
Star 3. Okay, so I've talked about this in terms of there's always this outside presence that is interfering with Kim and Jimmy's relationship. I talked about it in terms of Chuck. I talked about it in terms of Davis and Maine, whatever the case may be. Vince L., a loyal Polite Fight viewer, this is by email, not in the comments. He writes in, says, I love the longer Polite Fight episodes. Thank you, Vince. And then he goes on to say, I liked John's interpretation of the number 3 and some of the shots between him and Kim, although I didn't really consider Chuck to be the third wheel. Not that I'm discounting that, of course. Very polite. Vince getting in the Polite Fight spirit of entertaining multiple interpretations. Not that I'm discounting that, of course, but maybe that 3 is more representative of the 2 Jimmys, Jimmy McGill and Saul Goodman. And that's really how, when I saw that star 3 come up on the screen, I wasn't really thinking of the what I blabbed out last week. I was thinking of Vince's interpretation. I think this is right. Kim just wants to be with Jimmy, but Slippin' Jimmy or Saul, whoever you want to call it, is also there, and she can't get around that. And I don't think Jimmy can get around it either.
It seems like there's any infinite number of potentially valid interpretations of these threes.
Well, no, I don't think they're an infinite number, but we have 2 here, and I actually like Vince's interpretation better than mine.
As I said last week, I think that they are putting the threes in there intentionally, but I don't think that your interpretation or Vince's interpretation neither of them compels me more than the other, and that's my big.
No, I know. You have no idea here, so you've chosen to go to this meta level to get around the fact
That's not what I'm doing. No, that's not even true.
It's all right. We talked about it last week, and I'm just winding you up.
right.
That's all.
There's just too many possible
I'm just
interpretations.
kidding. That's twice I got you this week. Okay? For Gus Spellman, I'm John Tatey. Thank you for watching Polite Fight. We'll be back next week, of course. So long for now.
Bye.